inputs and outputs, welcome back to the channel. LSS announced the new -IO Armory Deck. In this video, I'm going to go over Armory Deck precedence and why I'm super excited for this deck in particular, the impact of the Armory Deck for mechanologists as a class, as well as my predictions and speculation on what could be hidden in the -IO Armory Deck. Without further ado, let's get started on what we know so far. We know that the Armory Deck is going to release on October 18th, 2024 worldwide, and so far there are 4 cards that have been released, with Heavy Industry Surveillance, Fast and Furious, Heavy Industry Gear Shift, and Cerebellum Processor. I'm going to go over these cards later on, but before we can go into these cards in particular, I want to go into the history of Armory Deck so far to establish the historical precedent that I expect for the new Armory Deck. The first Armory Deck, KO Armed and Dangerous. This deck brought powerful new equipment in Savage Sash, KO-specific support in Run Roughshod, and Arsenal Disruption in the card Strength Rules All. After the KO Armory Deck, we saw the Armory Deck for Sir Bolton, Breaker of Dawn. The Armory Deck gave him an armor suite to help him charge defensively, as well as Saving Grace to help provide additional defensive support, allowing him to survive until he was able to reach his Lumina Ascension combo later on in the game. Recently, we had the Azalea Armory Deck. And much like before, she got a new suite of equipment, but it supported new playstyles that had not previously been seen before, most notably Hidden Agenda enabling New Horizons lists. However, the Azalea Armory Deck gave Riptide a huge boost of support. First off, Riptide enjoyed access to Stone Rain, and secondly, the card Line It Up provided aim counter support for Riptide specialization Murky Water. So why am I going into this history and what does it mean for mechanologists? Well, based on the precedent seen so far, my expectation is that the -IO Armory Deck is not just meant for -IO, but rather to support the mechanologist card pool as a whole. The cards that we've seen so far provide a decent amount of support to both Datadol and Max. However, I'm not necessarily going to focus on Teklevossen, but rather the remaining 3 mechanologists. Next, I'm going to go into the cards one by one and talk about how I think they'll impact the mechanologist class as a whole, as well as support these 3 heroes. First off, we have Heavy Industry Surveillance, which is a mechanologist head piece of equipment. When this defends, you may banish the top card of your deck. If it's a mechanologist card, this gets +1 defense until end of turn. Notably, the first time you defend with it, if you banish a mechanologist card, it'll actually have 2 defense, and then the second time you defend with it, it'll actually have 1 defense. This card is a general upgrade to Hyper X3, improving on the Battle Worn 1 by defending for 2 and then 1. For -IO, this improves her ability to get defensive items out, or rather get items out on the opponent's turn. If you're defending against your opponent and the top card of your deck isn't an item, it sometimes can feel really bad. So being able to have a defensive banish from top of deck to help her search for items is going to be a huge boon. Secondly, I think that this is a strict upgrade for Datadol. This headpiece is going to be her best in slot. With Datadol's ability, anytime you banish an item from the top of your deck, it's going to enter the arena. And lastly, for Max, the extra block can be really helpful and is a general upgrade when compared to Hyper X3, specifically because they're creating them off of Max's ability. So I think that getting an extra block value to avoid on hits is going to be crucial for Max getting out the Construct Nitro Mechanoid. Next up, we have Heavy Industry Gear Shift. Much like before, Heavy Industry Gear Shift is going to also banish cards from the top of deck. However, rather than having Temper, this has Battle Worn. Destroy this, banish the top 2 cards of your deck, gain an action point for each mechanologist card banished this way. In general, this is an alternate option to Achilles Accelerator, particularly into the matchups where you don't expect to have to defend from any arcane damage. Into -IO, this card has additional synergy with Symbiosis Shot. Banishing the top 2 cards from your deck can allow Dash to dig for further items. Theoretically, if she pulls a crank item off the top after banishing the top 2 from Heavy Industry Gear Shift's ability, she could shoot Symbiosis Shot not just 2 times with the 2 action points, but the 3rd with the crank action point generated. For Datadol, this replaces Adaptive Plating. Particularly of note, the ability to banish 2 cards off the top not only gives her the extra action points, but in particular has extremely strong synergy microprocessor, giving her extra action points in order to get her overall game engine running. In Max, this could be a replacement for Cogworks, giving Max an extra point of defense value in order to get the Construct Nitromechanoid out. Next up is Fast and Furious. In general, I think this card is a really good boost attack for the class as a whole. It being 0 cost is fantastic and allows it to fit into most, if not any, cost curve. In Dash.io, I think it's especially strong. Putting it in your arsenal means that if you've played and cranked an item, it won't just be a 0 for 3, but a 0 for 4. With Data Doll, this attack helps tremendously with her cost curve. And finally, with Max, the second ability I think is really important to note here, in that it has Hyperdriver synergy and basically is acting as an extra crankshaft or Big Bertha. It allows him to keep those Hyperdrivers in play until he gets the Construct Nitromechanoid out. Next is Cerebellum Processor, a blue item that costs 0 with Crank. Cerebellum Processor says this enters the arena with 2 steam counters. At the start of your turn, destroy this unless you remove a steam counter from it. And it has a once per turn action that costs 0 that allows you to draw a card. At first glance, I think that this card is at a similar power level to Teklo Core. In theory, this card can give you a ponder for 1 to 2 turns, allowing you to essentially end your turn by drawing a card, arsenaling it. It also has incredible high octane synergy, where you could boost, get an extra action point, play this out, draw a card, and continue your turn moving forward. Looking at the heroes specifically, it is an incredible turn extender for Dash.io, allowing her to play it for 1 resource off the top of the deck at instant speed, but it's also a great Spark of Genius target for the reasons mentioned before. In Data Doll, being a blue item also helps with her cost curve, and that extra card draw at the end of the turn can essentially act as a pseudo 4 intellect for Data Doll. And lastly, with Max, it's a 0 cost crank item, so could be a theoretical target to run in Max lists. It being a crank item means that Max could play this with 2 steam counters, crank it, and then swing with Banksy rather than creating a hyperdriver, especially if he already has enough drivers in the arena in order to get out his Construct Nitromechanoid. So now that we've gone over the cards that have been shown to us by LSS, I want to go over cards that are probably going to be in the deck based on the teaser trailer from LSS. I'll link that in the description below. First off, we have Spark of Genius. It being a Dash specialization, it's extremely strong, allowing Dash to search her deck for a Mechanologist item with cost X, where X is half the amount paid, put it into the arena, and shuffle her deck. Also, if Dash is boosted this turn, Spark of Genius allows her to draw a card. Well, this action card normally does not have Go Again. Dash pulling an item with Crank allows her to crank the item put into the arena, regaining that action point. I expect that this Armory deck is going to be packed with items with the Crank keyword, making Spark of Genius an excellent choice. Besides Spark of Genius, we see Autosave Script in the trailer. It's a blue 0 cost item with Crank. Your Mechanologist attack action cards get, when this hits, put it on the bottom of the owner's deck. I do think that given the prevalence of boosting and banishing from the heavy industry equipment suite, that being able to put those cards back on the bottom of the deck with an overloop or underloop type of ability is going to enable her to not necessarily run out of cards by boosting and banishing so frequently. Next up is Polarity Reversal Script, a red 1 cost item with Crank. While Polarity Reversal Script is in the arena, action cards get -1 defense while defending your Mechanologist attack action cards. This item is also not normally run in Dash.io deck lists, but combined with Autosave Script and some of the other items that we'll talk about, can be extremely powerful in making sure that her attack actions are hitting or requiring opponents to block with more cards from hand in order to prevent those devastating on-hits. Now, switching back to defensive items, we have Dissolving Shield. We don't necessarily know which colors of Dissolving Shield are going to be in this deck. However, I would expect most likely to just have the red one in the deck. It's also a Crank item, costs 0, and the red enters the arena with 3 steam counters, and you can remove a steam counter in order to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to you this turn. Dissolving Shield is a fantastic card, allowing Dash to have a little bit of extra survivability. I kind of treat this as a 3 block, except it can prevent arcane damage, it can prevent Reckless Swing, it can prevent Riptide damage. Overall, it's an extremely flexible card. By getting Dissolving Shield in play, not only does Dash have the ability to prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to her, but she also gets to put a steam counter on her Symbiosis shot. And the last card that was shown in the trailer is none other than Boom Grenade. Unlike Dissolving Shield, I do hope that we get at least red and yellow, if not rainbow Boom Grenades, because they are such a mainstay in Dash lists today. Boom Grenade is a 0-cost crank item, and the red says when a Mechanologist attack action card you control hits a hero, destroy it and deal 4 damage, the yellow does 3, and the blue does 2 damage. A lot of the current competitive Dash.io deck lists are running multiple copies of Boom Grenade and running a plethora of attacks for awkward breakpoints in order to force the opponent to block out. Otherwise, they're going to take an additional 4 or 3 or 2 unpreventable damage off of the Boom Grenade. In addition to the cards from the teaser trailer, I'm going to go over some core cards in Dash.io deck lists to talk about what else I think might be in this Armory deck. So now that we've gone over the cards that are in the Dash.io teaser trailer, I'm going to go over some cards that are in traditional Dash.io competitive deck lists and talk about why I think they might or might not be in the deck. Similarly to the KO Armory deck where there's no misses, I think that this deck is likely to be all Mechanologist cards. First off, I expect Symbiosis Shot, Dash's signature weapon, to be in this deck. It is an extremely powerful weapon with Dash's ability. Anytime Dash puts a Mechanologist item into the arena, Symbiosis Shot will gain a steam counter, up to 6 total steam counters, and it is not limited to once per turn, where Dash can remove a steam counter from Symbiosis Shot in order to attack for 2. This is the spiritual successor to Tecloplasma Pistol, but in many cases can actually be stronger than Tecloplasma Pistol, given that the attack costs 0 resources and only requires her to remove a steam counter. Symbiosis Shot is extremely powerful when combined with cards like High Octane. Whenever Dash boosts, she'll gain an action point, drawing a card in the late game, especially when Symbiosis Shot has 4, 5, maybe even 6 counters on it. Dash can use High Octane, boost multiple times, maybe get an extra item out, and then fire Symbiosis Shot for 4, 5, sometimes even 6 times in a single turn, dealing devastating amounts of damage and really helping her to close out the game against her opponents. Next up, 0 to 60, especially in red, is a core card in Dash.io deck lists. It being a 0-cost 4 attack with boost means that it's very difficult for an opponent to block this out unless they have defense reactions such as Sink Below or Fate Foreseen. Given that the common competitive lists are running a high density of 4 attack boosts, I expect that we should also see yellow Zipper Hit as well as blue Throttle. We may see additional colors, but I expect to at least see red 0 to 60, yellow Zipper Hit, and blue Throttle for those reasons. On top of 0 to 60 Zipper Hit and Throttle, one card that I think would be really interesting to add into this deck list is red Soup Up. Not only is this card a 0 for 4, but it has a lot of synergy with Dash's items, saying if an item you control has been destroyed this turn, the card gets go again without requiring you to boost. On top of that, I think it would be a really interesting card to add to the deck list, particularly for its Galvanize keyword, allowing Dash to defend with Soup Up, destroying an item that might have its last counter or might be destroyed at the start of the following turn, being flexible based on the situation Dash is in. In addition to that, I expect 1 for 4 boost attacks like Fender Bender, which gets extra power depending on the amount of equipment defending it, as well as Outpace, which just can't be blocked by equipment at all. And lastly, given the amount of boost cards and banishing that we're expected to do, I would expect to see at least Backup Protocol Red in the list, and allows Dash to pay 2 resources at instant speed in order to destroy Backup Protocol Red and put a red Mechanologist attack action card from her graveyard into her hand. This is also notable because she can pitch an item that doesn't have any block normally in order to pull an attack action that blocks for 3 in order to help her defensively, but it can also be used offensively as well. Now that we've gone over the core cards as well as some of the cards that were shown in the teaser trailer, I'm going to go a little bit off the wall in order to go into some predictions and speculations. So if I had to guess the core 60 cards that are in this Dash.io deck list, given what we've seen and the general ratios for competitive Dash.io deck lists, this is the 60 that I expect would be run. I expect the majority of the attacks will either attack for 4 or 2 if they're in the blue slot. Paired with High Octane, these low-cost attacks can allow Dash to build up action points to fire her Symbiosis shot for multiple times in a turn. I'm not sure whether or not LSS would include Teclocore in the list, primarily because they have Cerebellum Processor. The reason I don't think it's going to be included is because all of the other items have Crank synergy, so I think that Teclocore not having Crank is a potential reason they would remove it. Don't get me wrong, I would be super excited to see it in the list, making it more accessible for new players, but I don't think it will, given some of the majestic frequencies that we've seen in other Armory lists, and given that I expect High Octane, Spark of Genius, and Cerebellum Processor to be the core Majestics making up this deck's primary game plan. So now let's go to the product sheet information. And there's something that I might be looking a little bit too deeply into, but nevertheless, the product sheet says that the Armory deck for Dash contains a 60 card deck, a hero, weapon, equipment, but the last thing which is interesting is that it says it contains token cards. And while this doesn't seem like a big deal, we saw the KO Armory deck obviously is going to have Might tokens. With the Bolton deck, we saw Courage tokens. And with Azalea, we had Blood Rot, Pox creating Blood Rot tokens. So why am I fixating on the fact that this deck contains token cards? Well, let me tell you why. And that is because the only Mechanologist token card that we have are hyperdrivers. But Dash has no current way to create token hyperdrivers outside of Supercell. Unlike Max, she can't create a hyperdriver on demand, and given that this deck is most likely to be focused on crank items, I don't expect this list to be running hyperdrivers. With that being said, let's go into what the possible tokens might be. One token that could be possible is the Quicken token. If we go back to Bright Lights, Quicken tokens were a part of that set, with multiple cards creating it in Evo Mock Breaker and Evo Charging Rods. Now, I don't think that either of these cards are going to be in the set, primarily because we've already seen the legs in Heavy Industry Gear Shift, which are not base legs, meaning that they can't be evolved into Evos. On top of those cards, the only other card from Bright Lights that created a Quicken token was Scrap Hopper. While Scrap Hopper was extremely useful for Teklovasen, it's not really seen in core Dash.io deck lists. For these reasons, I don't think Quicken tokens are going to be created. Outside of Quicken tokens, Eloquence tokens could be an interesting take on the Mechanologist playstyle, in particular because of the Eloquence token synergy with all of Dash's items, meaning that she can get extra action points whenever she plays an item and puts it into the arena. Given that Crank doesn't give the item go again, but rather nets an action point, Eloquence tokens could combine with Crank items in order to give Dash not just 1 action point, but 2. This might not be the case though, since Eloquence tokens are primarily generated by Shadow Rune Blades, although it would be a really cool token to add to Dash.io's playstyle. Another possibility for the Dash.io Armory deck is gold tokens. In Heavy Hitters, we saw the introduction of the universal keyword, and Wage Gold in particular being the only attack with universal so far. could indicate that we might be seeing Wage Gold in this deck list. I don't think it's likely, but I would highly support LSS printing more universal attacks. Gold in particular is pretty strong for -IO. One of the interesting things about gold is that it acts as an item that can be destroyed for Galvanize. On top of that, the gold token pairs fairly well with -IO's ability, essentially allowing Dash to pitch a blue, draw a card, and then maybe even play a zero-cost item from deck. So I think this could be possible, but I don't exactly know how it would fit in with the current structure of -IO deck lists. And lastly, I want to point to this picture here. In the Armory Deck teaser video, we see this equipment piece, which I think is going to be the heavy industry chess piece. This ties into the token piece because I think the remaining two pieces of equipment actually relate to how -IO is going to generate tokens. So typically with chess pieces like Vandal Spring Tunic or even Teklo Foundry Heart, we see that the chess piece is typically the equipment piece that creates resources or generates resources. So I think that the heavy industry chess piece is likely going to have an ability similar to the head and the legs, where that she can banish top cards from deck in order to generate potentially a vigor token. This would be interesting and would contrast it from Teklo Foundry Heart, where Teklo Foundry Heart provides resources for your current turn. This piece of equipment generating a vigor token, move those resources to a future turn, kind of acting like how Teklo Plasma Pistol does with Dash Inventor Extraordinaire, allowing her to pitch resources on turn 0 and use those resources for her pistol on later turns. It's kind of my first thought, and I'm curious to see what you think. And secondly, I think that given that we haven't seen the chest or the arm piece, I think that the arms could generate potentially might tokens in a similar way, given that the arms are typically there to buff the power of your attacks. So my theory at this point is that we haven't seen the chest or the arm pieces yet because they're going to be the pieces of equipment that generate tokens for Dash in order to allow her to have stronger turns, get those boom grenades off, attack for even more awkward breakpoints. An alternative thought is that Dash could be getting a construct like Construct Nitro Mechanoid, but I think that's a little bit too far to speculate today. Maybe we see a construct that relies on Steam counters. I'm not sure. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Let me know, did I go too far with the speculations? Did I miss anything? And also let me know what cards you think are going to be in this -IO Armory deck. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback in the comments below. But anyways, that's all for me. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll teach you in the next one.